All right, welcome back, everyone. Well, a lot of stories to go into as usual. Some interesting developments, some that even took me by surprise, to be honest. The Biden administration is allegedly, and I say allegedly because a lot of it's on sources of media and so on, but across the board right now, a lot of different outlets are talking about it. The Biden administration is looking to pay hundreds of millions of dollars or even more to illegal aliens who have come into this country who feel that they were hurt in some way by Trump's harsh border policies. It seems to be the case. This is focused on the allegations of family separation. I'll get into the details of that because the family separation issue is mainly because, well, the illegal aliens were using children, trafficked children, as tokens to get into the country, and then manipulating them. Well, they were children being trafficked who were sometimes not the biological children of the people they were with. They were tools of the coyotes, the human traffickers. And of course, the news went wild with it, claimed that kids were getting separated, claimed there were kids in cages. Turned out that was fake. Turned out that was from the Obama administration. We'll get into the details on this. But there's a big organization now trying to get these different kids, they're saying, to sue the United States. And the ACLU is currently working on this, and they're talking about $400,000 or more per family, sometimes even more, depending on the case. And well, as Americans are looking to go out of business, as Americans are looking to go into new lockdowns, as we're facing a financial crisis, as we're facing the debt ceiling, we may end up paying hundreds of millions of dollars to illegal aliens who feel offended on the way they were treated as they illegally entered this country. I'll be detailing that story. Also, some other interesting developments. There's been some claims that there is infighting in the Biden administration, particularly between Jill Biden, Joe Biden's wife, and Kamala Harris, the vice president. There are some signs of this. There were some recent claims of this made by Jack Posobiec. I'm going to be going over the claims and then the evidence to substantiate those claims. And it does seem to be the case that something may be happening with this. Also, folks, I mentioned that as the United States may get sued by illegal aliens entering this country, we also are facing huge issues of unemployment, possibly, as Biden prepares to roll out this vaccine mandate on any business with over 100 employees, and also on police. And right now you have New York City, one city, and you have examples of this across the whole country. New York City alone could lose a quarter of its police under these new policies. Of course, that's a city policy. I'll be getting into this, a lot of other stories. And folks, that said, it's great to have you all here. No shortage of stories these days. If there's anything great about 2021, is that there's always something to talk about with the news. I can say that. All right, folks, that said, it's good seeing you all here. Yeah. Useless Intellectual said it's new old news for the sake of being news. Yeah. Mr. Classic, he said, thank you, Josh, for the work you do. Pleasure, and do my best. Thank you. Eric Fitzsimmons, he said, because America is racist. Obviously, that's the only logical answer to this. Definitely. X8, he said, good, rent will be lower. Maybe. Actually, if depending on the way things go, you could see it from two directions in terms of rent. On one side, you have inflation. You have, well, a lot of different issues affecting the economy. I won't go into the details of this. At the same time, though, you have hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens entering this country on a monthly basis. And those hundreds of thousands, there were estimated 400,000 projected in October alone, of course, beyond what was actually captured. Those people need homes. Now, who's going to resettle them? Where are they staying right now? Turns out the Biden administration has been resettling them. So, folks, a lot to talk about tonight. I'm going to jump into the first story, and then we'll go into some questions around the halfway point. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat now. I'll try to get to them. But first off, let's talk about what's happening with Biden looking to pay the illegal aliens using your taxpayer money. It says here, U.S. in talks to pay hundreds of millions to families separated at border. And this is according to Wall Street Journal. It says here, Government is considering payments of $450,000 per person affected by Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy in 2018 for asylum seekers illegally crossing the border. The Biden administration is in talks to offer immigrant families that were separated during the Trump administration around $450,000 a person, according to people familiar with the matter. Keep in mind, they're citing anonymous sources, but they're saying, according to people familiar with the matter, Wall Street Journal tends to be among the better of organization of the mainstream media that tends to cite, unnamed sources. We'll see how accurate it turns out to be, but this is what they're saying. Now, they're saying, according to people familiar with the matter, as several agencies are working to resolve lawsuits that have been filed on behalf of parents and of children who say the government subjected them to lasting psychological trauma. Now, folks, if you're being trafficked, if you're a child and you're being trafficked across an international border, you can expect to have your traffickers arrested, and you can expect to be separated from your traffickers. Those traffickers may be your parents in this case, just going by law. And if you're violating the law, typically you're going to be arrested and separated from the people you were arrested with. One of the issues you have is with large-scale, hundreds of thousands of people, mass illegal immigration, is that, of course, some people are legitimate, some people are not. You're going to have some kids who are legitimately with their families. You're going to have some who are not. One of the problems they had, which is why Trump made this law, was because they found that a lot of the people who were traveling with kids were not traveling with their own kids. The kids they were traveling with were victims of human trafficking. The children were victims. And because they needed to make sure that they would not be abused by the traffickers, they needed to make sure that they wouldn't be, staying with the people who were illegally trafficking them, they separated them until they could do DNA tests. That was the nature of the child separation policy. Now, that being said, some of them probably were, and I would say almost definitely were, the legitimate children of these families. And it seems to be the case that side of the story is kind of the one that's only being shown to people. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is the organization now going and trying to find what seems to be the legitimate cases and trying to, sue the United States government, meaning your taxpayer money, to give them a whole lot of money for their actions to illegally cross an international border and come into the country because they were arrested. And as they were arrested, they were separated from their traffickers, sometimes their parents, while they were DNA tested. And here we are now. Now, it says here, the U.S. Departments of Justice, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services are considering payments that could amount to close to $1 million a family. So they're changing the numbers here a bit. They're saying that they were looking at $450,000 per person, but they're also saying $1 million per family. And so I have to see what this means, but it could change based on the family. Of course, a family is more than one person, $450,000 a person who was affected by it, about $1 million per family, they're thinking. Though the final numbers they're saying could shift. Some make it more, some make it less, possibly. Now, this is according again to unnamed sources they say are familiar with the matter. Most of the families that crossed the border illegally from Mexico to seek asylum in the United States included one parent and one child, the people said. Many families would likely get smaller payouts depending on their circumstances, the people also said. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which represents families in one of the suits, has identified about 5,500 children separated at the border over the course of the Trump administration. Keep in mind, folks, among the hundreds of thousands trafficked across our border or illegally crossing on their own, depending on the circumstances, they were able to identify 5,500. The mainstream media mainly says that all of these people are somehow, unaccompanied minors. That's the way the narrative usually is. Out of the hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors, they were able to find 5,500 possibly legitimate cases. Now, on this note, they're, of course, citing numbers that they provided to the government. Now, the number of families eligible under the potential settlement is expected to be even smaller than that, the people said, as government officials aren't sure how many will come forward, they're claiming. Maybe of the 5,500 they've identified, they're not sure how many of them maybe have legitimate cases also. Around 940 claims out of those numbers have so far been filed by the families, according to these unnamed sources. The total potential payout based just on that could be $1 billion or more. Now, folks, this is, of course, taking place as you have hundreds of thousands. Again, in October alone, there were projected to be somewhere around 400,000 illegal aliens crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, including from many countries. This is not just the United States. This is not just Mexico, as we often think with illegal immigration. This is Central America. This is Haiti. This is other continents, people coming across. And people who are crossing the border illegally, the Biden administration has, by law, under the Supreme Court, been ordered to restore Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. The way a lot of them are doing it is they're applying for asylum. The human traffickers, the actual human traffickers, give them guidance on how to apply for asylum using basic claims like, I feel like my life is in danger. I feel that there's a threat in my country. A lot of them don't come from countries, though, where that would be warranted, which is why you have the process of seeing if they're actually eligible for that, if they're eligible for actual asylum. And most of them, in the end, it turns out they're not eligible, hence the idea of having them wait in Mexico rather than in the United States, because when they wait in the United States and they have to show up for these hearings, typically they don't show up. Now, as this is happening, the Biden administration is basically working in an extrajudicial manner. They are violating the Supreme Court's order to restore the Remain in Mexico policy, meaning on one side, the administration is ignoring the law. They are, again, an extrajudicial force at this point. In addition to that, they're actually facilitating the trafficking into the United States. Jen Psaki has said during a press conference, White House press conference, that the United States is, in fact, the Biden administration is, in fact, taking people who are legally crossing into the United States and then continuing to traffic them to other parts of the country to help them resettle. Which means, in addition to being an extrajudicial movement, they're also participating directly in both human trafficking and in an action that violates U.S. law, being illegal immigration. In addition to that, these people are now being told that if they feel offended, if they feel they suffer psychological abuse, that they may be able to sue the United States government for that, which is what this case would set the precedent for. And in addition to that, you also have the issue, folks, that this is happening as American citizens are at risk of losing their jobs on a very, very large scale. You're talking, 2/3 roughly, or a third of the U.S. workforce possibly could be affected, not lose their jobs, but be affected by this new vaccine mandate they're rolling out. Of those numbers, mixed percentages are wanting to get vaccinated. We see in New York, for example, which we'll go into later, that the police department, about 25% of police in New York could lose their jobs. Americans are facing unemployment on a large scale if they have a moral issue with getting forced vaccines. And vaccines only under the narrative, if you take the altered definition they've used to call these vaccines. And given the situation as well, we also have a large financial crisis. We also have the debt ceiling getting hit. We also have inflation. We also have the real estate crisis coming from China, the shipping crisis, and other things. And while all of this is happening and hundreds of thousands of people are legally entering the country, violating American law, violating American sovereignty, as that is happening, these same individuals are wanting us to pay them hundreds of millions, possibly over $1 billion, because they feel offended by the U.S. law, Well, folks, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, especially given the point on another note, too, that this was an order from the President of the United States, written law. In other words, this is written law in a country. You can say that you feel offended when law is enforced, right? You can claim that you're offended, that you feel you had psychological damage because law was enforced, but it's the law. if the police come to your door and arrest your dad, which would be a terrible situation, but let's say your father or your brother or your cousin commits a crime, the police come to your door and arrest them. That may be a traumatic experience for you. But if you violate the law, typically you will be arrested, and typically through the process of being arrested, you will be separated from normal society. The arresting process typically separates you. And people now are unhappy because they were separated because of the process of being arrested for committing a crime. And so this will also set an interesting precedent, because is it okay to violate the law, essentially, and expect to not be arrested? And then if you are arrested, claim that the process of being separated from people as you're arrested, that process itself is somehow psychologically damaging. Very interesting case to look at, especially as even with the vaccine mandates, you have parents getting threatened to have their kids taken away from them under, for example, Child Protective Services. And as you have kids now looking to get Pfizer approval for the vaccines and what this possibly means. A lot to go into. We'll be talking about this a bit more. First, folks, I should mention, though, we are still demonetized by YouTube. Luckily, though, we do have sponsors. And tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. Over 155 million Americans were affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times just over this past year. People get anxious because they can't protect their online data or their online activity. But now there's a new email and messenger app called Secure. That's Secur. They can give privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are hosted in Switzerland. And Switzerland's important because it has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure is also the only private and secure messaging and email app that does not rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, which means it's not subject to the intrusive Cloud Act. Secure does not ask for your phone number, does not mine your data, and does not upload your contacts like all other applications of this type tend to do. Now, folks, if you use Secure, you can, of course, still chat with non-secure users by sending them an invite. And in this way, you're protected from hackers while you're on the app, from getting onto your phone. You also have full privacy while on the app. It costs only $5 for the messenger and $10 for the email and messenger package. You can visit secure.com today for a free 7-day trial, or you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And again, big things out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. Now, folks, as we're talking about paying hundreds of thousands of dollars per illegal alien, up to possibly $1 million per family or $450,000 per person, as the U.S. is facing all these financial crises and other things like this are happening, there's different estimates on the actual proposed spending packages that the Democrats are trying to push through. While they're talking about $3.5 trillion of the price tag of at least one of their programs, the actual price tag may actually be higher. It may actually be $7.5 trillion because of the way that they are manipulating the language to make it appear that it's less. Because one of the issues they have is when they pass these bills, when they pass these spending bills, sometimes it creates spending over time. In other words, the initial spending cost does not include the full length, the full lifetime of the spending that is put forward within these bills. So while it says 3.5 trillion, it may be 7.5 trillion. Again, that's more than double the amount on paper. Now let's go over this. It says here, this is New York Post reporting. It says true cost of Democrats' plan, $7.5 trillion and a lot of gimmicks. It says here, after months of criticizing Senators Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema for balking at the original $3.5 trillion price tag, congressional Democrats are finally accepting the reality and paring President Biden's social welfare package to between $1.5 trillion and $2 trillion over the decade, which you might have heard these are the new numbers that they're saying, that they've had some kind of, they've come together and they've agreed to much smaller spending packages. Now you're hearing again, $1.5 trillion. Okay, that's not as bad. That's like less than half of what they were talking about before. Maybe $2 trillion of the decade. Okay, fine. Not too bad. Yes, it's still a lot of money, but not too bad, right? Not nearly as bad as what they were saying. But folks, that doesn't include the full lifetime of what they're talking about or the full picture of how these things actually work, according to New York Post. It says here, instead of producing legislation, a bit further in the article says this, instead of producing legislation that truly costs $2 trillion of the decade, lawmakers are crafting as much as $4 trillion worth of new initiatives, but simply using fake expiration dates to score only a few years of each proposal. In other words, they're being misleading at the very least in the language of this and in the way they're pushing the narrative. They're being misleading on the actual lifetime of these initiatives, meaning that it's actually a lot more money, $4 trillion more when you count these other factors. Now it says here, the idea is to create new federal programs, hook the constituencies on new federal benefits, and then assume that future Congress and presidents will not dare to allow them to expire. Typically, folks, government likes to expand, and typically it's very difficult for government to contract, because when you contract government, that means you get rid of money people are being given, you get rid of jobs, you get rid of programs. It's very difficult to contract government once it has been expanded. And so, in other words, they can create these new programs, expand it even further, and anticipate that nobody would dare contract it, because contracting it would mean people losing their jobs, people losing free money, people losing these programs they're benefiting from. For example, Obamacare, a great example of that. How many people would lose health care if this unaffordable health care plan was gotten rid of? That, again, remember, folks, you can keep your health care plan, right? That's what they were told. Got to pass it to find out what's in it, right? Now, on this, it says those assumed extensions will then blow up the costs far above today's $2 trillion sticker price. For example, just one of these examples, the March stimulus law temporarily expanded the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 per child and $3,600 for children under the age of 6. It also expanded eligibility to higher incomes, and it's possible that illegal aliens could also be getting some of this money. There's been some different talk on this. Democrats have also made clear that they want this policy made permanent at a cost of $1.3 trillion just in that alone over the decade. Again, they're talking about $2 trillion over the entire spending package for this one program, $1.3 trillion over the decade estimated. Yet the initial reconciliation proposal expanded the policy for just 4 years in terms of the way they're presenting it. And now the White House is calling for just a 1-year extension. In other words, we're being told they rolled back some of the spending in order to have this agreement they've come to. They didn't roll some of this back. They rolled back the number of years that they're calculating the costs on. So let's say in the initial budget plan where they were saying it's going to cost all this money, they were looking at 10 years. And so instead of looking at 10 years, they're now talking about 1 year. And so obviously the amount of money you'd spend over 1 year is much less than 10 years, right? A tenth probably of the cost. And instead of doing that again, they've used this kind of gymnastics to make it appear that there's less money being spent than there actually is. Of course, this is considering whether or not future governments will continue to finance it. Typically they do, again, because of the issue that it's very hard to contract the government once it has been expanded. And then again, effectively through this, they're hiding nearly $1.2 trillion in upcoming costs just on that one piece of this very large package. Now, a bit further in the story, it says this. It says the White House has reportedly proposed 3 to 4 year expiration dates. They use the same trick in other areas on other initiatives, such as paid family leave, Medicaid expansion, and new Obamacare subsidies. So they use that same type of process where they didn't actually get rid of the programs, they didn't get rid of the spending, they just changed on paper the amount of time it would be funded for, again, with the anticipation that once they expand it, you can't contract it. That's what's happening with our budget. Again, as we're about to hit the debt ceiling, well, we're there, and there's currently no end in sight of them changing that. A lot more to go into, folks. Again, during the halfway point, we'll go into some questions. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat. Those of you curious, the drink of the night is it's Greek mountain tea, which is fantastic if you've never had it. The secret is you boil it, let it simmer for 10 minutes, put honey in it. It's wonderful. The Greek name for it, I believe, is iron. It's the Greek word for it. Yeah, it's wonderful. Highly recommend if you haven't had it. All right, folks, let's talk about this political infighting between Biden and Kamala Harris, because it's interesting to see that the far left and the moderates and even the establishment of the Democrats they seem to be clashing a lot right now. The timing of this is important because this is going into 2022 in the midterm elections when a lot of different factors could impact the Democrats' hold on both the Senate and the House, at least the House, but possibly the Senate as well. Now, it says here, and I'll go over some of this. Jack Posobiec, you might have seen him. He's a journalist. He's again a journalist, conservative. He was on War Room Pandemic with Steve Bannon, and during this segment, he made an interesting claim. He claimed that Kamala Harris, the vice president, is referring to Joe Biden as the Titanic behind his back. Again, that the vice president herself is criticizing the president of the United States, calling Joe Biden the Titanic. This is within the Democrat Party. In other words, something that is sinking, and as it's sinking, maybe she anticipates that she's the rising star. At the same time, this is happening, Jill Biden, Joe Biden's wife, the first lady, was asking if it was possible to remove a sitting vice president over the past weekend. Bizarre stuff. Jill Biden is inquiring about, after I believe it's the 25th Amendment, the ability to remove a president from office. What about a vice president? That's the first lady, it seems to be the case, looking into the possibilities of removing Kamala Harris as vice president. There's very strange infighting taking place right now. Now, I'll go into this just on the basic claims Jack Posobiec makes and others have made. They're claiming that multiple sources have confirmed that Jill Biden has asked about using the 25th Amendment to get rid of Kamala Harris. Now, keep in mind, these are anonymous sources. This is Jack Posobiec making this claim. Take it for what it's worth, of course, as always. But he tends to be pretty credible, and so I'd say this is a credible claim. But he's claiming, again, multiple sources have made this claim. And the history of this is not too far, which I'll explain in a minute. But also he's claiming people wanting to engage with the administration right now. If people want to engage with the Biden administration, they're apparently not going to Joe Biden now. They're going to Kamala Harris. Now, remember that for a lot of the institutions, a lot of the factors behind the Democratic Party, they wanted Kamala Harris to be the front runner, a lot of them. The organizations that backed Barack Obama, for example, and helped him become president of the United States, those same organizations, the main ones who did that, were behind Kamala Harris, not behind Joe Biden. Harris did very poorly during the Democrat debates. Biden was the front runner. And so basically they made her again vice president. The rest is history. Now it seems to be the case that some of these organizations are, the way they're approaching it, they seem to be treating Kamala Harris as if she's already the one in charge, and you have some pushback now from the Biden family on this. Now, again, we can't fully confirm this. Jack Posobiec is making these claims around the idea that Jill Biden may be inquiring about using the 25th Amendment to remove Kamala Harris from office. But, again, take it for what it's worth, but there is some precedence to this, which does give some ground for this. Now, this is an article from San Francisco Gate. Not a conservative media by any means, meaning that the opposite side of the political spectrum from, Steve Bannon and these guys. Back in May 20th, they reported new report reveals depth of Jill Biden's rage toward Kamala Harris during the 2020 primaries, meaning that even during the primaries, Jill Biden and Kamala Harris did not get along. I won't go over the details of those allegations of what Jill Biden was saying, but she used some pretty strong words, including some curse words, allegedly, according to even the San Francisco gate against Kamala Harris. It seems, again, that this infighting may be reaching a precipice, and it's getting worse. We'll see what the implications of this are. At the same time, you're having divisions taking place within the Democrat Party itself. And so this division that's taking place between really the far left, people like Kamala Harris, the kind of Democratic Socialists of America types, and the more establishment or even the moderate Democrats don't seem to be getting along. There's a lot of infighting right now, and it's actually looking to prevent a lot of the very strong far left policies they're trying to push through. This infighting goes, it seems, to the very top, right to the White House, according to these different sources. And again, we can substantiate some of these claims using circumstantial evidence. Can't fully verify it, but again, given the whole picture, it's very plausible at this point. Now, I'll get into the stories of what's happening within the Democrat Party itself in just a bit, but folks, let's get into some questions because it's around the halfway point now. Real quick note, too. I mentioned, of course, that we've started now the Crossroads Book of the Month. So if you haven't got our newsletter yet, be sure to sign up. We, of course, announced this in the newsletter. You can find the newsletter linked in the description below this video, whether you're on YouTube or on Epic TV. You can also find on the screen right here, it's ept.ms/Crossroads exclusive newsletter. And folks, again, the book of the month for October is Debunking the 1619 Project by Mary Graybar. And Mary Graybar has agreed now to do a special live Q&A this coming Sunday with all of us here. So folks, if you've read the book, if you haven't read the book, it's all fine still. This coming Sunday, we're going to have a special Q&A as part of the normal episode we do every Sunday. Where Mary Graybar is going to be a guest on the show. And so if you have questions about her book, Debunking the 1619 Project, if you have questions about what's being taught to your kids who may be getting this education, this critical race theory education, and you're wondering what they're being taught, if you just have questions about Christopher Columbus or the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, much later, bring your questions because she has written this book which goes really in-depth into this. And again, hopefully we'll be doing this every month as we do this book club. We try to get authors to come on. Regardless, we're going to be working on a few other things. We're making the main announcements for this in the newsletter. So again, if you haven't got the newsletter yet, be sure to sign up. Also, folks, we do now have Epic TV. I know a lot of you are watching Epic TV now, and thank you for being here. We have some other great shows there I want to tell you about. Larry Elder, of course, who ran for the recall election of Gavin Newsom in California. He, of course, does a show with us, the Larry Elder Show, and he had a great episode just recently called Sage Steele Under Fire for questioning Obama's racial identity. Let me show you a quick trailer of that right now.
Sage Steele is a broadcaster with ESPN. She happens to be biracial, and she's under fire for making this comment about Barack Obama.
Barack Obama chose black and he's biracial. I'm like, well, congratulations to the president. That's his thing. I think that's fascinating considering his black dad was nowhere to be found, but his white mom and grandma raised him. But hey, you do you.
MSNBC Hee Haw's Tiffany Cross, not happy.
What? So that is undoubtedly a black face, whether or not she knows it, but it is most definitely not a black voice. Yet I'm sure someone is giving themselves a big diversity pat on the back by having that modern day minstrel show, Sage Step and Fetch It, on the airwaves spewing her continued nonsense.
Step and Fetch It?
Oh, would y'all bring that big box in and have all? We ain't got enough candy to fit no box that big.
This is not for candies.
All right. Again, that's Larry Elder, the Larry Elder Show, exclusively on Epic TV, and I believe on YouTube as well. If you haven't watched it, be sure to check it out, folks. You can find the link in the description below. All right, that says jump into some questions. And folks, again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, whether you're on Epic TV or on YouTube. Try to get to in just a bit. First one up is from GMA.PA1. He said, question. Do you think the deliberate chaos this administration is creating is just a push for the socialistic communist takeover? A few different points on that. again, I can't say that Biden wants to make a communist take over the United States. I couldn't say that. But you could say that based on circumstantial evidence, what they're doing, either unintentionally or intentionally, could fit that description, frankly. If you understand what socialism is, and again, socialism, I'll briefly explain socialism and communism. Marx had this idea of, because a lot of people don't know the difference. Marx had this idea of the social evolution, that societies evolve first from the primitive communism state, like the cavemen, up to the agrarian state, the farmers, and so on, like pre-communist Russia, the Tsarist state, up to capitalism, the industrial society, leading into socialism, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat, also called state capitalism, where the state seizes control of the means of production and the means of, producing, whether economically or whatever else. And that this state of tyranny can then agitate society, leading to a destruction of traditions, morals, everything that previously existed. And then you have, through that desolation, the rise of a new system, communism. And that this communist man, divorced from tradition, divorced from previous ideas, divorced from religion, divorced from ideas of family structures and so on, will then create a new society of which it's a utopian vision that they don't actually know what will be. It's very much like Obamacare, as they initially presented it, right? You got to pass it to find out what's in it. And that was actually, Marx said something along those lines. Marx argued that essentially communism is of the future, so you can't argue what it will be like, which was an argument they used to basically get rid of people criticizing the possible validity of the system on whether it would function or not. He said you can't even debate whether it would function or not because it's something of the future. It's something we don't have yet, and you can't imagine from your current state what it will look like. In other words, you got to destroy society first. You got to destroy religion first. You got to destroy traditions first if you want to find out what communism looks like. That's essentially the idea. So typically when you're talking about communism in power, you could say that the Communist Party of China is motivated by a communistic worldview. They have a communist party, a communist education system. Party members are forced to have study sessions. They have to give money to the Communist Party. But the system itself, as long as the system exists, will always be socialist. Socialism is the system. Communism is the belief, is the simple way to understand it. Now, in terms of the belief, you could say, yes, a lot of these people are guided by a communistic belief. And there are many factions of communism, many different interpretations of how communism would work. You could say that the Build Back Better idea, using this green fraud narrative, is a communistic vision, essentially, of remaking society. The Green New Deal, for example, is a communistic vision of the United States. You could look, for example, at the idea of World Economic Forum and the idea of the Great Reset. Again, the idea of basically resetting society. Again, we talked about desolation, destroying the previously existing institutions and creating something new. A Great Reset being the same basic concept of a communist revolution. You could talk about the ideas of Build Back Better, also very much in line with those exact same ideas, that through the desolation, you can rebuild society, remake it in a new image. That's the idea. Now, in terms of takeover, you were talking about the possibility of using chaos, as you describe it, deliberate chaos, in creating a push for socialistic communist takeover. In terms of the takeover, that would get into the ideas of ideological subversion. Several books you could go into on this. Golitsyn's, can't remember the name of it. Anthony Golitsyn wrote a book on this. You have Disinformation by Ion Mihai Pachepa. Also, Love Letter to America by Yuri Bezmenov, who wrote that under a pseudonym, which was Thomas Schulman, I believe. Now, under the ideas of this, basically, the ideological subversion process works to destroy an existing system from within. Very much a Fabian school type concept. The idea that the communists should put on the suits of the proletariat, should put on the suits of the bourgeois, pretend they're part of the system, and use their positions by gaining control of the unions, gaining control of government, gaining control of police, use those positions of authority to work as the heads of the snake and take down the whole system. Now, when it came to Yuri Bezmenov, you can watch his interviews online. They're fantastic. He's unfortunately dead now, but he did some fantastic online interviews I highly recommend watching about Soviet ideological subversion, things the CCP, the Communist Party of China, is still doing under its unrestricted warfare doctrine. Subversion works in a few different stages. The first stage is demoralization. You want to make people hopeless. You want to destroy the moral fabric of society. You want to take every institution in society and make it serve the opposite function, or at the very least start to make it not function properly. You want to destroy the elements of social harmony. If you're dealing with a country like the United States, a multicultural society, what is it that creates social harmony? It's the ability of races to get along with each other, different races. It's the ability of different religions to get along with each other. It's the faith in the institutions, things like this. People trusting their local police. People trusting their neighbor. People, for example, if you have your neighbor, you don't call the cops on them when you have an issue. You go talk to him yourself and work things out. That is the element of social harmony. The demoralization process is to make you begin to lose faith in that. After you demoralize society, you begin to destabilize society. You make those institutions not only work as things that don't have trust, that don't have public trust, but they begin to serve their opposite functions. For example, church should be entertainment, not something about religion. Police should be a tyrannical force, not a social beneficial force, such as like COVID lockdown policies. Police, many of them not willing to enforce them, I should note. Rather than talking to your neighbor about, if you have an issue, you call the police on them anytime you have a problem. Things like this, social breakdown. Things stop functioning, government begins serving its opposite function. Everything is acting against the function it's supposed to serve. Once you bring it to that stage, then you move into conflict. Now, the largest stage is the demoralization stage. This takes the longest. The destabilization stage, not so long. The conflict stage, even shorter. This is where you bring people to the state where they're fighting in the streets. You have mass protests. You have burnings of buildings and things like this. The socialist agitators take to the streets, much like the BLM riots and Antifa riots and so on. From there, you move to normalization. Normalization is when you've pretty much destroyed society, and then you propose the solution to fix it. You have essentially you've created a disease. Let's say you've sickened someone. You've been poisoning their drink, and then you say, "Well, comrade, I got here an antidote for you. I know you wouldn't want to take this before, but I have an antidote for you now. Will you take it? It'll make you all better." And a sick man will seek any doctor, as the Chinese saying goes, and they'll take it. Just like this, many countries accept communistic policies because they view the communistic policies as a solution to the chaos they are witnessing. They become willing to accept tyranny that they would never accept under a normal circumstance. And that typically is how these programs are implemented. Typically, that's how communist revolution takes place. That was the methodology used by the Soviets under, again, not dialectical materialism. That would be the strategy. Under, again, ideological subversion. And books you can read on this, again, check out Love Letter to America by Thomas Schulman. His real name, Yuri Bezmenov. You probably can't find a print copy of it, but you can find archives of it online. It's a short book, maybe I think only 50 pages. I really recommend reading it. And China's doing the same thing. The Chinese Communist Party just picked up the baton of the Soviets, and they're doing the exact same thing under the ideas of unrestricted warfare. It's the exact same thing. I won't go too deep into that, and frankly, there are a lot of other organizations doing it too. There are plenty of organizations here in the United States doing the exact same thing as well. Next question here is from Evelyn Vin. In every country communism gains power, authoritarianism and death followed in its wake. Communism promises a world without suffering, and yet, in its execution, does the exact opposite. Following Lenin's death, Stalin's 29-year reign killed an estimated 60 to 66 million people. More famines and purges would occur. The very peasants that communism was supposed to benefit instead starved to death under its rule. The party dictates what is right and wrong. Mao ended up killing between 50 million and 70 million people. As an investigative journalist, I want to understand why. All right. Unexpected commercial. Surprise. But anyways, well, speaking of which, I did a series of videos around this topic. Check it out if you haven't. That's the Dark Origins of Communism. That's on Epic TV exclusively, by the way. All right, so that note, let's go into some more questions, though. It says here, this is from Evelyn Vincent, and you're saying, Joshua Philipp, who do we contact in the government to voice our opinion that we do not approve of illegals getting hundreds of thousands of our taxpayer dollars? Well, this is, if it's going to be a legal challenge, it's going to go through probably the courts, the Biden administration, maybe trying to reconcile with them. We'll have to see. But you can contact your local elected official and get them to try to represent your interests, to call them out for it, because typically public opinion and public outcry is what impacts things, especially, frankly, during an election cycle. And so I would say that if this becomes a global or a national news story, and a lot of outlets pick it up, and a lot of senators and people in the House of Representatives pick this up and begin making noise about it, it could be a big deal, especially as we go into Christmas season, and especially as we go into Christmas season and Black Friday, when they're talking about the shipping crisis, which is probably going to mean a lot of you can't buy the presents you might want to get for Christmas, they're saying right now. As we're facing a lot of financial crisis, as we're facing, again, Biden rolling out these new vaccine mandates that are going to put a lot of people out of work right before Christmas, that combined with news stories publicly that while they're losing their jobs and while American citizens are being treated that way, that illegal aliens are being given hundreds of thousands of dollars because they didn't like being arrested while violating U.S. law. Take those two together, folks, and it's going to look bad on them at the very least if they don't try to roll it back. So I'd say contact your local representative if you don't agree with the policies. Another question from Galt. He said, how long after signing up before we can expect a newsletter? I still haven't heard anything. If you sign up to the Epic or the Crossroads newsletter, you should be getting one, I believe, every week or every other week. I have to double check on that. I've been writing them. I've just been so busy with a few other things that I'm hoping to tell you all soon about. I can't quite remember, but do sign up. It's at least once a week. Is the idea with it, and so I'll keep you updated on that. Next up from Shannon Haney, said, Josh, did you see the press conference about the nursing home where they were ballot harvesting and voting on behalf of the elderly and deceased residents in Wisconsin? Any chance of charges? I did see that they were going to announce a case on that. I did see the case from Wisconsin. There's been a few different issues like this. And on that note, too, Arizona, the attorney general there is allegedly right now talking about possibly launching an actual criminal investigation into what happened during the 2020 elections in Arizona. We'll see what happens with this. There have been reports on it. We'll see what happens with it. But the investigations into the 2020 election are moving forward, and it's moving in some ways into criminal investigations. Texas has also been going very strong with that as well. Another question from Not My Halo. You said, hi, Josh, could Obama be brought back in under a national emergency? Why did he of all former POTUS, President of the United States, buy a mansion blocks away from the White House? Out of respect, they move away. Thanks. Well, it's hard to say Obama's reasoning for buying this mansion just down the street from the White House. One of the big, this was not just a claim, right? So back in 2016, Trump came into the White House as president of the United States, and there were mainstream news stories saying that Barack Obama was building a war room just down the street from the White House to basically challenge the Trump administration. There were a lot of different stories suggesting they may have been violating things like the Hatch Act and other things, individuals tied to the former Obama administration, that there were, of course, internal issues of news agencies and spreading fake news reports being used by politicians to spread disinformation about the Trump administration. They used this whole Trump-Russia hoax, which is now possibly even being prosecuted. Individuals tied to it, at least some of them are already, under the special counsel appointed Durham. In other words, they were doing things constantly. They were constantly rolling out false information. They were constantly rolling out scandals. These scandals were constantly being exposed as false. Some of these scandals may have actually violated U.S. law. And you had stories of Obama setting up a war room, as they were calling it, just down the street from the White House to do things right along these lines. Now, it's not clear where this is or why he did that. If we take the mainstream news articles, it's because he wanted to build a war room to fight against the Trump administration. Would that suggest, though, that he was running essentially a shadow government? I don't think he could be brought in as an official president of the United States. You could say that he could have significant influence from behind the scenes within the party, which he does. So we'll see. Another question here, then we'll go into some more stories. This is from JJ. You said, do we know that we can expect a fair and correct election in 2022, or are the Democrats guaranteed to win? Well, folks, I'd say don't be demoralized. It's important to still go to the polls. It's important to still vote. It's important to still get out there because it's doubt in the integrity of the system. I mentioned, folks, the ways of ideological subversion. The first one is demoralization. Do not let yourself become demoralized. Demoralization is when you lose faith in the basic functionings of institutions. And there are organizations that do shock and awe operations using what is not nearly systems that are not nearly as powerful as they appear on the surface to give you the illusion that they have more control than they actually do, more authority than they actually do. Typically, communist revolutions are done by an extreme minority, very small organizations of very extreme individuals. And I'll give you a few examples. The Bolshevik Revolution was a very small portion of the actual, military that led the rebellion against the Tsarist Russian government. Basically, Lenin and his individuals did their march and took the Capitol building and then just declared themselves the leaders. Essentially, their actual raid of the Capitol building in Moscow was not really a violent raid, even though later on under the Soviets they presented it as such. They pretty much walked in and just claimed that they owned the place. That was essentially how they won. It was a minority even within the groups that launched the rebellion against the Tsarist Russian government. In China, under the Chinese Communist Party, the Little Red Guards and the communist movements are basically leading everything. If you were in, say, a town hall meeting and they were having a vote on whether you wanted to go, let's say kill the local landlord because they were trying to do these things, you'd be sitting in there and maybe there's 50 people in the room. Maybe the communists would go in with just 5 people. But through different tricks, they make it look like they had a huge majority within that room. And what they do is things like this. They'd have one guy give a speech and he'd say, we need to do this and we need to do that. Then they'd have one of their other members, an agitator, speak out and say, maybe a few of them say, yes, yes, and maybe move around a bit. They would cheer them. They would make it seem that they have a huge influence within the audience. And through positioning in different parts of the audience, make it appear there was consensus, much greater consensus than it appeared in reality. Make it appear there was consensus for the things they were trying to do. The people quietly watching this would keep quiet because they didn't want to get their heads chopped off. And they figured, I might be the only person in this room who thinks like I do. I better keep my mouth shut. I better not say anything because these crazy communists, they might go after me if I dare say anything. Without knowing that, the overwhelming majority of people in that room were people just like them who were thinking probably the exact same thing. Typically, again, I mentioned internet censorship. You don't need to censor the internet if you don't fear the truth. You don't need to censor social media if you don't fear the marketplace of ideas. You don't need to have mass control of the media and shutting down, independent voices if you're not afraid of the influences independent voices can have. These are not signs of strength. They're signs of weakness. And so I would say, don't let yourself be demoralized. We are witnessing shock and awe tactics made to basically demoralize a population, I would say. And whether intentionally or not, that is the impact. And methods to make you feel powerless in the face of elections and these types of things. Do not engage in the systems. If you accept it, then it becomes true, essentially. And so I would encourage you to still go vote. Whether you believe in the integrity of the system or not, still go vote. Yeah. And frankly, I think that it's not as widespread. If you want to flip a federal election, you need to affect maybe 10 counties, 10 swing counties. It's not a huge number of counties you need to hit to swing an election. And so that doesn't apply to House and Senate, which is the ones coming up. So get out and vote, folks. Don't let yourselves be demoralized. That would be my advice on this. All right, that said, I want to go over a couple more stories because time is getting short. I want to talk about this billionaire tax credit that's actually been scrapped. I mentioned there are signs of breakages taking place within the Democrat Party, up to the highest levels, allegedly between Jill Biden, possibly Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. There's allegations of a split taking place. And the evidence of this split is not just at the highest levels, it's at other levels as well. Let me get into this. It says here, billionaire tax proposal in chaos. House Democrats say plan has been scrapped moments before Senate Finance Chair pushes back and insists we're continuing to work with members. This is the Daily Mail reporting. It says Democrats' proposal for new billionaire tax to pay for Joe Biden's Build Back Better agenda has hit a stumbling block just hours after the proposal was rolled out Wednesday. It continues further on, stating, it's the latest in a series of intra-party divisions, breakages taking place, being played out at the public stage as Democrats desperately try to hammer out a deal on Biden's multi-trillion-dollar spending initiatives this week. The proposed tax would have hit the gains of those with more than $1 billion in assets or incomes of more than $100 million a year, and would provide funding for the president's sweeping $2 trillion or $7.5 trillion, how you read it, social reform and climate change spending bill. Upon release, the plan, Wyden estimated, it would affect 700 of America's most wealthy taxpayers and bring in as much as $250 billion. Now, $250 billion is a lot of money. That means it's not fully financed, though. They still have to get, again, $250 billion out of $2 trillion, or if you can estimate the entire thing, 7.5 or ish trillion dollars, meaning that a lot of that money would still come from the average taxpayer. And of course, if billionaires suddenly are no longer billionaires because you've killed the local shop owner, you've killed the local landlord, those assets don't always stay there, as communist revolutions often find. Now, it seems to be the case that Democrats might have seen the writing on the wall with this, the moderates at least. It says in here, but further in, the plan finally folded just 6 hours after it was announced. They proposed that idea within the Democrats themselves, among them, people disagreeing. That proposal folded after just 6 hours after it was announced when moderate Senator Joe Manchin, one of two members of the president's party, the Democrats, and the upper house who have been roadblocks to Biden's ambitious social reform and climate change plans, voiced their concerns. Now, Manchin told CNN later on, he said, I don't like it. I don't like the connotation that we're targeting different people as people that basically they contributed to society and create a lot of jobs and a lot of money and give a lot to philanthropic pursuits. Interesting story here, folks. Now, on this note, too, it's getting late, but I want to go over one more story because I was talking about what's happening in New York City, and this is not just New York City, it's other parts of the U.S. as well. Folks, more than a quarter, more than 25%, 1 out of every 4 police in New York City could lose their jobs because of the vaccine mandates. And I can tell you, I work in the city, most days of the week. A lot of crime is already legal, it seems. One of the few things they threaten you on these days if you fail to wear a face mask on the bus or subway or something like that. Other than that, you can do drugs on the street. You can defecate in front of the local shop. You can do all kinds of crazy things in New York and not get a hard time with it. You take that and you take also the stabbings and random attacks in the subways, people randomly pushing people in front of subways on the tracks, crimes, violent crime rising quite a bit. And you would suddenly decide to reduce the police force by 25% on top of this, as you're also beginning to transport hundreds of thousands of people illegally into the country who are going to need housing, who are going to need jobs, who are not within the system and can't legally work, meaning that if they want to work, they have to get government money or they go into crime. Well, it's an interesting time for this. Let's say that. And as also, you have police not just responding to crimes, you have police responding to emergencies in general. And if they're claiming we're having a pandemic, if they're claiming that there's record cases in hospitals or whatever, and suddenly you have lower capacity at hospitals because a lot of doctors, nurses, other medical workers have been fired, because paramedics have been fired on a large scale. They were talking, I think, 50% in some areas refusing to get vaccinated, could be fired. Joe Biden himself even saying on record that police who do not get the vaccine should be fired. Take that whole picture into consideration and what it means if there is a crisis, a medical crisis, as they claim there is. Not only that, but consider the other implications on a more broad scale with this. And consider as well that if you're importing hundreds of thousands of people and you're promising them also free healthcare, New York City gives free healthcare to illegal aliens, what that also means for hospitals and capacity. Now it says here, more than a quarter of New York City's 55,000 member police force could get sent home without pay, kind of fired, if they don't comply with the mayor's order to get vaccinated against COVID-19 by Friday's deadline. Folks, that's tomorrow. We're going to find out right quick. It says NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea is trying to sway officers, some of the most vaccine-hesitant workers in city government, to comply with last week's order by Mayor Bill de Blasio. They're saying now about 73% of NYPD workers have at least one shot, which means that as many as 27% of police employees could be placed on unpaid leave starting Monday, next week. And that's going to be when the mandates take effect, if they don't get vaccinated by 5 p.m. on Friday. And could you even vaccinate that many people between now and then? Now, Mayor Bill de Blasio says he feels ready to handle a dramatic drop-off in the number of officers. He's saying even if we lose a quarter of the officers in New York, he feels ready to handle it, even as violent crime continues to plague the city. But it remains unclear how the department would keep enough officers on the streets. So he feels it's going to be fine, but he also is not clear how he's going to keep enough officers on the street. Also, remember, he's using taxpayer money to have his own private security detail as well, increased security detail for himself, suggesting he believes that the city is less safe. A bit further in, it says this is Mayor Bill de Blasio, who instituted the order last Wednesday, says he expects officers to hold out until the last minute. They're playing a game of chicken, is what he's suggesting. And he said, what I expect is a surge of activity, particularly on Friday. We'll see who wins for this, folks. We'll see who wins this game of chicken, again, playing with the lives of Americans and New Yorkers. We'll see how it goes. Now, the police unions are, of course, pushing back very heavily against this. This is not just a New York issue. There's other cities as well. Chicago, for example, has a very similar issue taking place, and a lot of police in Chicago are also looking to either resign, possibly get fired, possibly, or laid off to unpaid leave, or go with what Mayor Lightfoot is trying to push right now as well, in a very similar vein to this. We'll see what happens. Police officers tend to be very closely knit, not just in a city, not just in a state, but even across the whole country. If their fellow peace officers are being impacted by this in one state, peace officers in another state may stand by them. And if they fold, they see it as betraying sometimes even their fellow officers across the whole spectrum. We will see how this works out. We'll see what it means also in terms of law enforcement, because again, you can't have a lot of these policies without enforcement arms. How are you going to enforce the vaccine mandates and vaccine policies if the people who would enforce them either don't agree with them or just can't work and are not there? They're going to have to find something else probably. All right, folks, a lot to talk about. Always more than we can get into in a single night. That said, just a quick reminder again, this coming Sunday during our normal Q&A, we're going to have a special guest. That's going to be Mary Graybar, author of our book of the month, which is Debunking the 1619 Project. So come ready with questions about the book. Come ready with questions about the founding of the United States or about the 1619 Project, critical race theory, what's being taught to kids, what's being taught in these different special seminars and so on. She's a powerhouse, a walking dictionary of this stuff. And so she can probably answer a lot of really great questions on this. Also, folks, it's the end of the month. And so we have our new book, the book for November, book of the month, Crossroads book of the month for our book club is going to be The American Story. The American Story, The Beginnings by a father and son team. That's David Barton and Tim Barton. So get a copy of it. It's a fantastic history book. They do wall builders. They have the largest private holding of American founding documents in the country. They're fantastic, and the book is very good. I've just finished it, actually. Highly recommended. Join our book of the month. We'll see if we can get one of them on end of November. And again, we'll be talking about it in the newsletter as well, which again, you can find linked in the description below. All right, that said, folks, I'll show you a quick trailer at the end of this video. American thought leaders had a great interview with Michael Schellenberger on the root cause of Americans' homelessness epidemic and why the term homeless is actually misleading. Great interview. Check it out. I'll show you the trailer at the end of the video. You can find the link again in the description below to Epic TV and to some of our shows there. Folks, as always, though, it's always a pleasure doing these Q&As. Always great talking to y'all. And please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.
We see people in San Francisco with open wounds, open sores. They're dying of drug overdoses. The popular idea that we should just simply help people to remain heavily addicted, but in a slightly safer way, I find it just offensive and quite cynical. Many people need the intervention.
Today I sit down with Michael Schellenberger, author of the books San Francisco and Apocalypse Never.
We're literally paying people in the form of cash welfare, housing, and other services to live in tents on the street, use hard drugs, defecate publicly, and commit crimes.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek.